October 25th, 1944, 6:53 in the morning. A young American officer is standing watch on a destroyer, waiting for his breakfast. He asked the mess boy for a fried egg sandwich and some coffee. Nothing special, just another quiet morning in the Pacific. The sea was calm. The wind was gentle. Any poet would have admired the picturesque cumulus clouds drifting lazily through the sky. The sun was just coming up, painting the horizon in shades of gold and pink. The officer's name was Robert Hagen. He was 25 years old. He'd been through 4 invasions and had never seen a shot fired in anger at his ship. It was a good record, a lucky record. His luck was about to run out. Then someone spots something on the horizon. Pagoda-shaped masts rising out of the morning mist. Shapes that shouldn't be there. Ships that shouldn't exist in these waters. And the officer realizes he's looking at the largest battleship ever built by human hands. A ship so massive it weighs more than his entire task force combined. A ship that could sink everything in sight without breaking a sweat. He never got that fried egg. Because in the next 3 hours, this tiny American destroyer would do something that military historians still struggle to explain. It would charge directly at a fleet of 23 Japanese warships, including 4 battleships, and somehow win. Not by surviving. Most of the crew wouldn't survive. But by doing something so insane, so unexplainable, that the Japanese admiral in command of the most powerful surface fleet Japan had ever assembled looked at this single destroyer attacking his battleships and decided to retreat. This is the story of the USS Johnston and her captain, a Cherokee Indian from Oklahoma, who told his crew on the day they commissioned the ship, "This is going to be a fighting ship. I intend to go in harm's way. Anyone who doesn't want to go along had better get off right now." Nobody got off. And 1 year later, almost to the day, that promise would be tested in the most brutal way imaginable. To understand what happened that morning, you need to understand what wasn't supposed to happen. October 1944. The war in the Pacific has turned. The Americans are advancing island by island, getting closer to Japan, and now they're invading the Philippines. General Douglas MacArthur has just waded ashore at Leyte, fulfilling his famous promise from 1942, "I shall return." There are 130,000 American soldiers on that beach. They have tanks, artillery, ammunition, food, medicine. All of it came by ship. All of it is still coming by ship. Those supply lines are everything. Cut them, and 130,000 soldiers are stranded on a beach in enemy territory with no way to fight and no way to leave. The Japanese know this. They've known it for months, and they've been planning for this moment. Operation Shogo, the victory operation. Here's how it works. The Japanese will split their remaining fleet into 3 forces. The southern force will come up through Surigao Strait from the south. The center force, the big one, will come through San Bernardino Strait from the west. And the northern force will come down from Japan. But here's the trick. The northern force isn't really an attack force. It's bait. These carriers barely have any planes left. They're the last carriers Japan has, and they've been stripped almost bare. Their entire purpose is to lure the American Admiral, William Halsey, away from the invasion beaches. Once Halsey takes the bait and chases the decoy north, the real attack forces will slip through the straits and annihilate the landing ships at Leyte Gulf. It's desperate, it's risky, and it requires everything to go perfectly. On October 24th, American submarines and aircraft find the center force in the Sibuyan Sea. They attack. They sink the super battleship Musashi, Yamato's sister ship. They damage other vessels. The center force turns west, appearing to retreat. Halsey gets reports of the Northern force coming down from Japan. He sees carriers, and he makes a decision that will haunt him for the rest of his life. He takes the bait. Every battleship, every fleet carrier, every heavy cruiser, gone, racing north to destroy Japanese carriers that are essentially empty shells. Behind him, the San Bernardino Strait stands unguarded, and in the darkness of October 24th, the center force turns around and comes back through. Guarding the northern approaches to Leyte Gulf are three small task units. They're called Taffy 1, Taffy 2, and Taffy 3. Taffy 3 is the northernmost group, the one closest to San Bernardino Strait, the one that will be hit first if anything comes through. And Taffy 3 is not a fighting force, not in the traditional sense. It consists of 6 escort carriers. These aren't the big fleet carriers like Enterprise or Yorktown. Escort carriers are something else entirely. They're built on cargo ship hulls with flat decks welded on top. They're so slow that sailors joke the CVE designation stands for Combustible, Vulnerable, Expendable. The escort carriers can make 17 knots. A Japanese heavy cruiser can make 35. Simple math says if a cruiser chases an escort carrier, the chase is over in about an hour. The carriers are armed with a single 5-inch gun each, for self-defense against aircraft, not for fighting warships. Protecting these 6 slow, unarmored, barely armed escort carriers are 7 screening vessels, 3 destroyers, Johnston, Hull, and Heermann, 4 destroyer escorts, Samuel B. Roberts, Raymond, Dennis, and John C. Butler. That's it. Combined displacement of Taffy 3, about 55,000 tons. Displacement of the Yamato alone, 72,000 tons. The Yamato weighs more than everything in Taffy 3 put together. Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague commands Taffy 3 from his flagship Fanshawe Bay. He's a competent officer, but he's not expecting a surface engagement. His job is anti-submarine patrol and ground support. His planes are loaded with anti-personnel bombs and depth charges, not armor-piercing weapons. Most of his pilots have never trained for anti-ship attacks. Nobody expects what's coming. Nobody, except maybe one man. The Johnston was commanded by Ernest Edwin Evans. Evans was born on August 13, 1908, in Pawnee, Oklahoma. His mother was Cherokee and Creek. His father was of mixed ancestry. In a Navy that was almost entirely white, and an officer corps dominated by Annapolis graduates from established families, Evans was an outsider from the start. Oklahoma, in the early 20th century, was not kind to Native Americans. The land that had been promised to them as long as grass grows and water runs had been taken piece by piece. Treaties had been broken. Reservations had been dissolved. The Cherokee, Creek, and other tribes had seen their nations destroyed within living memory. Evans grew up in the shadow of that history. He knew what it meant to be dismissed, to be underestimated, to be told you didn't belong. He didn't have political connections. He didn't have wealthy relatives. He came from a place that mainstream America preferred to forget existed. But he had something else. He had fire. Evans joined the Oklahoma National Guard as a teenager. Then he enlisted in the Navy in 1926, serving as a common seaman. Through sheer determination, he won an appointment to the Naval Academy. He graduated with the class of 1931, one of the few Native Americans ever to do so. His classmates called him Chief. They meant it as an insult. He wore it as a badge of honor. Evans worked his way up through the ranks. Destroyer duty, cruiser duty, aviation observer. He saw the Pacific. He learned the Navy. And then came December 7th, 1941. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, Evans was serving on the destroyer USS Alden in the East Indies. Over the next few months, he would participate in some of the worst Allied defeats of the war: the Battle of the Java Sea, the chaos of the Dutch East Indies. He watched ships go down around him. He saw what happened when commanders hesitated, when they failed to fight hard enough, when they let the enemy dictate terms. By 1943, Evans had command of Alden, but he wanted something more. He wanted a new ship, a fighting ship. In mid-1943, he got his wish. He was ordered to Seattle to oversee the construction and fitting out of a brand new Fletcher-class destroyer, hull number 557, the USS Johnston. On October 27, 1943, exactly 1 year and 2 days before the battle that would make her famous, the Johnston was commissioned at Seattle-Tacoma Shipbuilding. Evans gathered his crew on the fantail for a speech. "This is going to be a fighting ship," he told them. "I intend to go in harm's way, and anyone who doesn't want to go along had better get off right now." Not a single man moved. Edward DeGardy, who would be officer of the deck during the battle off Samar, remembered, "He stated that he now had a fighting ship and would never retreat from an enemy force. He meant it." The Johnston spent the next year proving her captain's words. January 1944, the Marshall Islands. The Johnston bombarded Kwajalein and Namur, supporting American troops storming the beaches. During the bombardment, Lieutenant Robert Hagen, the gunnery officer, spotted a Japanese officer on the beach waving a saber, trying to rally his men. Hagen trained all 5 of Johnston's guns on the man and fired. The officer vanished. Commander Evans, watching from the bridge, said, "Mr. Hagen, that was very good shooting, but in the future, try not to waste so much ammunition on one individual." February 1944. Eniwetok, more bombardment, more support for the landing forces. May 1944. The Johnston hunted and sank the Japanese submarine I-176 with depth charges. Evans received the Bronze Star. July 1944. Guam. The Johnston fired over 4,000 rounds of ammunition, destroying Japanese gun batteries and military installations. Then Peleliu. More carrier escort duty. 4 invasions in 1 year. Kwajalein, Eniwetok, Guam, Peleliu. And through all of it, the Johnston had never lost a single man to enemy action, never even had the paint scratched off her hull. By October 1944, some of the crew were getting restless. They'd been to war 4 times and never really seen a fight. On the night of October 24th, as the Johnston cruised 15 miles off Samar Island, Commander Evans turned to Lieutenant Hagen. "Well, Hagen, we're within 3 days of being 1 year old. It's been an uneventful year." "Yes, sir," Hagen replied, trying to sound gruff. "I wouldn't mind seeing a little action." Evans was planning a birthday party for the crew. 1 year of service, time to celebrate. They never got to celebrate. At 6:37 a.m. on October 25th, an Avenger pilot from the escort carrier St. Lo spotted ships on the horizon. At first, he thought it must be Halsey's fleet. Who else would be out there? He flew closer. Then he saw the distinctive pagoda-shaped superstructures, the massive turrets, the rising sun flags. "I can see pagoda masts," he radioed frantically. "I see the biggest meatball flag on the biggest battleship I ever saw." Admiral Sprague on the Fanshawe Bay refused to believe it. He demanded positive identification. This couldn't be right. But it was. Coming through San Bernardino Strait, completely undetected in the night, was Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force. 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, 11 destroyers, and leading them all was the Yamato. To understand what Taffy 3 was facing, you need to understand what the Yamato was. The Yamato was not just a battleship. The Yamato was the largest, most powerful battleship ever constructed in human history. A vessel so massive that the Japanese built special dry docks just to accommodate her. A ship so secret that even many Japanese naval officers didn't know her true specifications. Length, 263 meters, almost 3 football fields. Displacement, 72,000 tons fully loaded. Armor, the main belt was 410 millimeters thick. The turret faces were 650 millimeters. Nothing in the American arsenal could penetrate that armor at any reasonable combat range. And then there were the guns. 9 46-centimeter naval guns, the largest ever mounted on a warship. That's 18.1 inches. Each gun could fire a 3,219-pound shell over 26 miles. Each shell weighed more than a small car. Each turret weighed more than an entire American destroyer. The muzzle blast from Yamato's guns was so powerful that the Japanese had to install special shielding around all the anti-aircraft positions. Otherwise, the blast would kill the crews stationed there. This was what Taffy 3 was facing, plus 3 more battleships, plus 6 heavy cruisers armed with 8-inch guns, plus 2 light cruisers, plus 11 destroyers. Against this armada, Taffy 3 had escort carriers armed with 1 5-inch gun each and destroyers with 5 5-inch guns. 5-inch guns against 18-inch guns. Lieutenant Hagen said later, "We felt like little David without a slingshot." At 6:58 a.m., the Yamato opened fire. The shells screamed across the water. Where they landed, they threw up enormous geysers of colored water. Red, green, yellow, pink. The Japanese used die-loaded shells so each ship could identify its own splashes and adjust their aim. Admiral Sprague later said the colored splashes were almost beautiful, like a deadly fireworks display. He ordered his carriers to turn east, away from the Japanese, and run at maximum speed. He ordered smoke screens. He ordered all aircraft to launch immediately. But the carriers could only make 17 knots. The Japanese cruisers were doing 30, some were doing 35. The range was closing by almost a mile every 3 minutes. The Japanese battleships were firing from over 30,000 yards, nearly 17 miles. At that range, the American 5-inch guns were useless. They couldn't even reach the enemy. For 20 minutes, Taffy 3 could only run and hope the shells missed. They needed time for the aircraft to launch and attack, time for help to arrive, time for something, anything, to change the equation. And then Commander Ernest Evans changed it. Without orders, without authorization, without waiting for permission from Admiral Sprague. At 7 a.m., Evans ordered the Johnston hard to port and headed directly at the Japanese fleet. Alone. He was going to attack. His executive officer, Jesse Cochran, stared at him. Hagen stared at him. The entire bridge crew stared at him. They were a single destroyer. They were facing 4 battleships and 6 heavy cruisers, and they were charging. Evans looked at his crew and said simply, "We're going to attack." Lieutenant Hagen had one thought. "Please, sir, let's not go down before we fire our damn torpedoes." The Johnston raced toward the Japanese at flank speed, 35 knots, everything her engines could give. Behind her, she laid a smokescreen, a white curtain billowing across the water to hide the carriers from Japanese gunners. For the first 20 minutes, the battle was completely one-sided. The Japanese guns could reach the Johnston. The Johnston's guns couldn't reach the Japanese. All Evans could do was zigzag between the towering shell splashes and pray nothing hit them. At one point, an 8-inch shell landed close enough to splash red dye all over the bridge. Lieutenant Hagen wiped it off his face and said, "Looks like somebody's mad at us." But they kept closing the range. 30,000 yards, 25,000, 20,000. Finally, at 18,000 yards, just over 10 miles, they were within range of the 5-inch guns. Hagen opened fire on the Kumano, the nearest heavy cruiser. He'd set up his guns in a ladder pattern, firing a spread of shells designed to walk across the target. When he started seeing his rounds burst in the cruiser's superstructure, he tightened the pattern to concentrate the damage. 5 guns, 15 to 18 rounds per minute. In 5 furious minutes, the Johnston pumped over 200 shells into Kumano. Then Evans gave the order everyone was waiting for. Fire torpedoes! All 10 torpedoes leaped from their tubes, fanning out in a spread aimed at the burning cruiser. Johnston turned hard, racing for the cover of her own smokescreen. When she emerged on the other side, the crew watched Kumano through their binoculars. At least one torpedo, possibly 2 or 3, slammed into the cruiser's bow. The explosion was massive. When the smoke cleared, Kumano's entire bow was gone, blown completely off. A destroyer had just crippled a heavy cruiser. For exactly 45 seconds, the crew of the Johnston thought they might actually survive this. Then the Yamato found them. The world's largest battleship turned her attention to the tiny destroyer that had just mauled one of her cruisers. At 7:30 a.m., 3 18.1-inch shells hit the Johnston almost simultaneously. To understand what this means, you need to understand what an 18-inch naval shell does. Each shell weighs 3,219 pounds. That's heavier than most cars. It travels at roughly 2,500 feet per second. When it hits, the kinetic energy is almost beyond calculation. The Johnston was a Fletcher-class destroyer. She was designed to survive maybe one hit from a 5-inch shell. Maybe. 3 18-inch shells hit her at once. The first shell tore through the deck and penetrated the engine room. It started fires and knocked out the rear engine spaces. The second shell devastated the aft section of the ship, destroying gun mounts and killing crew. The third shell hit forward, adding to the catastrophic damage. Then, immediately after, 3 6-inch shells from Yamato's secondary battery hit the bridge. One of those 6-inch shells exploded directly in front of Commander Evans. The blast blew off 2 of his fingers. Shrapnel shredded his shirt and peppered his body with metal fragments. He was covered in blood, half naked, missing parts of his hand. The medical officer tried to help him. "Get the wounded out of here," Evans said. "Don't waste the morphine on me." He refused medical attention. The Johnston was in catastrophic condition. 2 of her 3 boilers were destroyed. Her speed dropped from 35 knots to 17. Her radar was gone. Her gyroscope was wrecked. The electrical system was failing. Several gun mounts were knocked out. Lieutenant Hagen looked at the damage and later wrote, "It was like a puppy being smacked by a truck." Any sane commander would withdraw, maybe try to limp away under smoke cover, maybe abandon ship. Evans looked at the situation and made a different decision. He saw the Japanese cruisers closing in on the escort carriers, specifically on Gambier Bay, the slowest carrier in the group. He was going back in. The Johnston had no torpedoes. She'd fired all 10 in the first attack. She had 1 working engine. Her speed was cut in half. Half her guns were destroyed or damaged. Her captain was missing 2 fingers and bleeding from shrapnel wounds all over his body. None of that mattered. "Commence firing on that cruiser," Evans ordered. "Draw her fire on us and away from Gambier Bay." The Johnston's remaining guns opened up on the heavy cruiser Huguro. The logic was brutal. Gambier Bay couldn't outrun the Japanese cruisers, but maybe the Johnston could distract them. Maybe she could make herself enough of a nuisance that the cruisers would turn their guns on her instead. It worked. The cruisers shifted fire to the Johnston. Shells that would have hit Gambier Bay were now aimed at the destroyer. For the next 20 minutes, the Johnston zigzagged through shell splashes, firing continuously with her remaining guns, deliberately making herself the most attractive target on the battlefield. But Evans still wasn't done. At 7:27 a.m., Admiral Sprague finally ordered a coordinated torpedo attack. All destroyers and destroyer escorts were to charge the enemy and launch torpedoes. Small boys, attack! The Johnston had no torpedoes left. She'd fired them all. Evans joined the attack anyway. He led the charge, without torpedoes, with 5-inch guns against battleships. The USS Hole charged with him. The USS Herman charged with him. The destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts charged with him. Each of these ships has their own incredible story. The Hole was commanded by Leon Kentberger. She was the first ship to respond to Admiral Sprague's order to attack. She charged directly at the Japanese battleships, launching torpedoes at the Congo. One torpedo may have hit, accounts differ, but Hole's attack bought precious minutes for the carriers. The Japanese battleships and cruisers focused their fire on her. In the next hour, Hole was hit over 40 times, 40 direct hits. Her captain was wounded. Her executive officer took command. He was killed. Another officer took over. He was wounded too. Hole went down at 8:55 a.m., 15 minutes before the Johnston. Of her crew of 253, only 86 survived. The Samuel B. Roberts was even smaller than the destroyers. She was a destroyer escort, barely 1,400 tons. Her captain, Robert Copeland, knew his ship had almost no chance against battleships. He attacked anyway. The Roberts closed to within 4,000 yards of a heavy cruiser, point-blank range in naval terms, and launched her torpedoes. One hit the cruiser Cherokee, crippling her. Then Roberts turned her guns on other targets, firing so rapidly that her barrels literally melted from the heat. She went down at 9:35 a.m. after taking catastrophic damage. Of her 224 crew, 89 were lost. The Herman was the last destroyer standing. She fought through the entire battle, somehow surviving despite taking multiple hits. She was still fighting when Kurita ordered the retreat. These were the small boys, 3 destroyers and 4 destroyer escorts, against the most powerful surface fleet Japan had ever assembled. The Johnston was the first to charge, but she wasn't alone. They were all going to die, and they knew it. But they were going to buy time for the carriers. For the next 2 hours, the Johnston seemed to be everywhere at once. When a column of Japanese destroyers moved to attack the carriers with torpedoes, Johnston turned into them alone. She opened fire at point-blank range, hitting the lead destroyer Shigur multiple times. The entire Japanese destroyer squadron turned away. A single, crippled American destroyer had just turned back 11 Japanese destroyers. When the Japanese cruisers pressed their attack on the carriers, Johnston harassed them, fired at them, drew their attention. When it looked like Gambier Bay would be overwhelmed, Johnston put herself between the carrier and the enemy. She took hits that were meant for Gambier Bay. Lieutenant Hagen watched his captain during this period. Years later, he wrote, "He was magnificent. I can see him now, short, barrel-chested, standing on the bridge with his hands on his hips, giving out a running fire of orders in a bull voice. And once he gave us an order, he didn't ride us, but trusted us to carry it out the way he wanted it done. It was that quality of leadership which made all of us willing to follow him to hell." They were in hell. By 8:30 a.m., the Johnston had been hit so many times that no one could count the holes anymore. Her speed was down to 15 knots, then 10. Her guns were failing one by one as fires spread and power was lost. The bridge filled with smoke. It became uninhabitable. Evans had to abandon it. He moved his command to the fantail, the rear of the ship. There was an open hatch there that led down to the steering compartment. All steering control was gone. The rudder had to be turned by hand. So Commander Ernest Evans, missing 2 fingers, covered in blood, stood over that open hatch and shouted steering orders to sailors turning the rudder manually while shells exploded all around him. At 9 a.m., a shell penetrated the last functioning engine room. The Johnston went dead in the water. Dead in the water. No engines, no steering, most guns destroyed. The Japanese destroyers moved in. They formed a semicircle around the crippled Johnston and opened fire from every direction. One survivor, Clint Carter, said it was like a bunch of Indians attacking a prairie schooner. The Johnston fought back with whatever she had left. One gun was still firing. The crew worked it frantically, sending shells toward the enemy destroyers even as shells slammed into their own ship from all sides. Then that gun went silent too. The Johnston was finished. Everyone knew it. At 9:45 a.m., Commander Ernest Evans gave the order every captain dreads: abandon ship. The men began going over the side. Some were wounded, some were burned, some were already dying. They dropped into the oil-slicked water, grabbing onto anything that floated. As they went into the water, they watched their ship. The Johnston was split almost in half, where Yamato's 18-inch shell had hit her earlier. Fires burned from stem to stern. She was listing heavily, settling lower and lower. At 10:10 a.m., the Johnston rolled over and began to sink. Her bow went down first. Then her stern rose into the air, hanging there for a moment as if reluctant to follow. Then she was gone. A Japanese destroyer, the Ukikaze, moved in close. The American survivors, floating in the water, expected machine gun fire. That was what the Japanese often did to survivors. Instead, something unexpected happened. The Japanese captain was standing on the wing of his bridge, watching the Johnston disappear beneath the waves. He saluted. The entire crew of the Ukikaze stood at attention and saluted the American destroyer. Clint Carter, treading water, saw it happen. He said the captain was smartly dressed and rendered the salute with full military formality. Even the enemy knew they had witnessed something extraordinary. Of the Johnston's 327 crew members, about 270 made it into the water. For the next 50 hours, they drifted in the Philippine Sea, clinging to 3 life rafts and 2 floater nets. They were only 50 miles from Samar. They expected rescue within hours. There were so many American ships in the area, planes flying overhead. Surely someone would come. No one came. Not the first day, not the first night. The reason was confusion, poor communication, fear that Japanese ships were still in the area. Search efforts were launched, but they searched the wrong locations. So the men of the Johnston floated and waited. During the day, the sun was brutal, tropical sun beating down on men with no shade, no fresh water, dehydrated, and many of them wounded. At night, the temperature dropped. Men who had been overheating now shivered uncontrollably. Hypothermia began to set in. And then there were the sharks. The sharks came the first night. Survivor Glenn Parkin, who was 89 years old when he described this at a reunion decades later, still couldn't talk about it without crying. What made it bad was when a man would die, there was nothing you could do to help him, he said. You would take off their dog tags and they would float 3 or maybe 5 feet, and then the sharks would get to them. The men learned to release the dead at night. In the darkness, at least they didn't have to watch. During the second night, Lieutenant Hagen fell asleep on a raft. He drifted away from the group. When he woke up, he was alone in the open ocean. He had to swim back to the raft. If he hadn't woken up, he would have died alone in the dark. One man, Chief Gunner's mate Harry Henson, got bitten by a shark. The shark released him, then bit him again, then released him again and swam away. Henson survived. He had 2 sets of shark teeth marks in his thigh for the rest of his life. Not everyone was so lucky. One sailor had his stomach torn open by a shark attack. He lay in a life raft in agony, begging his shipmates to end his suffering. Someone tried to shoot him with a sidearm. The waterlogged gun misfired. Another sailor took a knife and cut the man's throat. They considered it mercy. There were other horrors in the water those 50 hours. The wounded died slowly. Men who had been hit by shrapnel, burned by fires, injured in the explosions. They held on for hours, sometimes a full day, before their bodies gave out. Kapok life jackets only stay buoyant for about 20 hours. After that, they become waterlogged and start to sink. On the morning of the 2nd day, 18-year-old seaman Bill Mercer took off his life jacket when he realized it was pulling him under instead of holding him up. He had to swim, exhausted and dehydrated, just to stay alive. Some men hallucinated. They saw rescue ships that weren't there. They called out to friends who had already died. They tried to swim toward islands that existed only in their minds. Some men gave up. They simply let go of the rafts and drifted away into the sea. At least 3 friendly aircraft flew directly over the survivors in the first hours after the sinking. The men waved and shouted. The planes didn't see them. Or if they did, they didn't report it. The survivors were left in the water while rescue efforts searched the wrong coordinates. Decades later, at reunion after reunion, the survivors would talk about those missed chances. If just one of those planes had seen them, if rescue had come 12 hours earlier, 24 hours earlier, a lot of men would still be alive. On the morning of October 27th, 2 full days after the battle, landing craft finally found the survivors. The rescue ships approached and someone called out, "Who won the World Series last year?" A voice from the water answered, "To hell with baseball! Get us out of this water!" The gunners on the rescue ships were firing their machine guns as they approached. At first, the survivors thought they were being attacked. Then they realized the gunners were shooting at circling sharks. One by one, 141 men were pulled from the sea. 186 were gone. Commander Ernest Evans was last seen in a life raft, still giving orders to his men. He was never seen again. Here's the part of the story that military strategists still can't fully explain. At 9:25 a.m. on October 25th, while the Johnston was making her final stand, Admiral Kurita made a decision. He had 23 ships. He'd lost 1 heavy cruiser. 2 others were damaged. But he still had 4 battleships, including the Yamato. He still had most of his cruisers. He still had his destroyers. The path to Leyte Gulf was open. The escort carriers were scattering, some of them damaged. The destroyers that had attacked him were sinking or crippled. 130,000 American soldiers were on the beach at Leyte with their supply ships and transports. Kurita could have ended the Philippine invasion that morning. Instead, he ordered a retreat. He turned his fleet around and sailed back through San Bernardino Strait. He was so close to victory that he could taste it, and he ran. Why? Historians have debated this for 80 years. Part of it was confusion. Kurita's communications were terrible. He'd lost contact with many of his ships during the chaotic battle. His flagship, Yamato, had been forced to turn north at one point to avoid torpedoes, and he'd lost situational awareness. Part of it was the air attacks. Aircraft from Taffy 2 and Taffy 3 had been harassing his ships all morning. Many of the planes had no bombs. They'd been armed for ground support, not anti-ship attacks. But they made attack runs anyway, strafing with machine guns, even making dry passes with empty bomb racks just to distract the Japanese gunners. Part of it was fear of what was coming. Kurita expected Halsey's battleships and fleet carriers to appear over the horizon at any moment. He didn't know Halsey was 300 miles north, still chasing the decoy fleet. But a major factor was simply this: the ferocity of the American attack broke his confidence. His staff officer, Rear Admiral Tomji Koyanagi, admitted after the war that the repeated attacks by the Johnston and the other small ships convinced the Japanese they were facing cruisers, not destroyers. The way they attacked, the aggressiveness, the willingness to charge directly at battleships. No destroyer would do that. But they did. Kurita looked at ships like the Johnston and concluded he must be facing a powerful American battle force. He expected to be overwhelmed at any moment. He was wrong. There was nothing behind Taffy 3 but empty ocean and 130,000 vulnerable soldiers. But he didn't know that. What he knew was that a tiny destroyer had charged his battleships alone, taken unbelievable punishment, and kept fighting until she literally couldn't float anymore. If one destroyer fought like that, what would a whole fleet do? Kurita decided he didn't want to find out. Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz later wrote, "The history of the United States Navy records no more glorious 2 hours of resolution, sacrifice, and success." Naval historian Samuel Eliot Morison put it even more directly. In no engagement in its entire history has the United States Navy shown more gallantry, guts, and gumption than in the 2 hours between 0730 and 0930 off of Samar. Here's something most people don't know about the Battle off Samar. We have Japanese accounts. We know what they were thinking as this battle unfolded. And what they were thinking is fascinating. Admiral Kurita's staff officers were experienced men. They had fought from Pearl Harbor to Midway to the Marianas. They knew what American ships looked like. They knew the difference between a fleet carrier and an escort carrier, between a heavy cruiser and a destroyer. But in the chaos of that morning, with smoke screens everywhere, with planes attacking from every direction, with shells flying and ships maneuvering, they made mistakes. Big mistakes. They identified the slow escort carriers as fleet carriers, the biggest warships America had. They identified the destroyers as heavy cruisers, ships 3 times their actual size. Why? Because of how they fought. The Japanese had seen American destroyers before. They knew the normal tactics. Destroyers screen, they lay smoke, they protect. They don't charge battleships alone. But the Johnston charged, without orders, without hesitation. She raced directly at the most powerful surface fleet Japan had ever assembled and opened fire. That's not what destroyers do. So the Japanese concluded she must not be a destroyer. Rear Admiral Koyanagi, Kurita's chief of staff, wrote after the war that the aggressive attacks convinced them they were facing fleet units, heavy cruisers at minimum, possibly battleships waiting over the horizon. The enemy's counterattack was so swift and furious that we believed we had engaged a main force, he wrote. Think about that for a moment. A 2,050-ton destroyer convinced the crew of a 72,000-ton battleship that she was a heavy cruiser or better. Ernest Evans didn't just fight the Japanese, he confused them. He made them doubt their own eyes. He made them second-guess their intelligence. And in that confusion, they lost their nerve. The Japanese understood courage. They valued it. Their entire military culture was built around it. Bushido, the way of the warrior. But what they saw that morning off Samar went beyond anything they expected from their enemies. One survivor of the Johnston reported that as their ship was sinking, a Japanese officer on a nearby destroyer watched through binoculars. When the Johnston finally went under, he removed his cap and bowed. The captain of the Yukizaka saluted. Multiple Japanese ships held their fire on survivors in the water, something that didn't always happen in Pacific naval battles. The Japanese knew what they had witnessed. Even as enemies, they recognized something that transcended the war. They had seen men who would rather die fighting than retreat. Men who charged into impossible odds without hesitation. Men who kept fighting even when their ship was destroyed beneath them. The Japanese understood that kind of courage, and they respected it. Let's talk about what Ernest Evans and his crew actually saved that morning. The immediate answer is 6 escort carriers and their crews, roughly 8,000 sailors who would have died if Kurita had pressed his attack. But that's just the beginning. Behind Taffy 3 was the entire Leyte Gulf invasion fleet, hundreds of transport ships, thousands of landing craft, mountains of supplies, and on the beaches of Leyte, 130,000 American soldiers. If Kurita had broken through, if the Johnston and the other small boys hadn't bought enough time, those soldiers would have been stranded, cut off from supply and reinforcement, surrounded by Japanese forces. It would have been a catastrophe, potentially the worst American military disaster of the Pacific War. MacArthur's triumphant return to the Philippines would have become a death trap. Instead, the invasion succeeded. The Philippines were liberated. Japan lost access to the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies. The war was shortened by months, possibly by a year. How many lives does that represent? How do you calculate the value of a war ending sooner? Every American soldier who came home from the Pacific, every Japanese civilian who survived because the war ended earlier than an invasion of Japan, every Filipino who lived because the occupation ended earlier. The ripple effects extend beyond any calculation, and it all hinged on the actions of a few thousand sailors in the early morning hours of October 25, 1944. Ernest Evans didn't live to see any of it. He didn't live to see the liberation of the Philippines. He didn't live to see Japan surrender. He didn't live to see the world his sacrifice helped create. He died in the water somewhere off Samar, probably within hours of leaving his ship. Sharks, exposure, dehydration, we'll never know exactly, but his widow received his Medal of Honor. His sons grew up knowing what their father did. His story passed into Navy legend. And 80 years later, a new destroyer will carry his name. Commander Ernest Evans was awarded the Medal of Honor posthumously. He was the first Native American in the U.S. Navy to receive the honor. He remains one of only 2 destroyer captains in all of World War II to receive it. The citation reads, in part, "Conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty." Commander Evans gallantly diverted the powerful blasts of hostile guns from the lightly armed and armored carriers under his protection. Seriously wounded early in the engagement, Commander Evans, by his indomitable courage and brilliant professional skill, aided materially in turning back the enemy during a critical phase of the action. The Johnston received the Presidential Unit Citation, the highest honor that can be given to a ship. His widow, Margaret, received the medal on September 28, 1945. Their 2 sons watched. For decades, the Johnston lay on the bottom of the Philippine Sea, deeper than any shipwreck ever surveyed. Her final resting place was unknown, unmarked. Then, in 2019, a research vessel found wreckage at the edge of an undersea cliff at over 20,000 feet. They thought it might be the Johnston, but they couldn't confirm it. In March 2021, explorer Victor Vescovo descended in his submersible DSV limiting factor to investigate. Vescovo is a former U.S. Navy commander himself, and this mission was personal to him. He had been to the top of every continent. He had been to both poles. He had dived to the deepest point in all 5 oceans. But this dive was different. This was sacred ground. The Johnston sits in the Philippine Trench, one of the deepest places on Earth. To reach her, Vescovo had to descend through 4 miles of black, crushing ocean. The pressure at that depth is over 600 atmospheres. Most submarines would be crushed like tin cans. It took hours to reach the bottom. When the submersible's lights finally illuminated the wreck, Vescovo saw something remarkable. He found the Johnston at 21,180 feet, more than 4 miles down. That's 62% deeper than the Titanic. When the submersible's lights illuminated the wreck, Vescovo saw something remarkable. The Johnston was largely intact. Her gun turrets were still in place, still pointed toward where the Japanese fleet had been. Her torpedo racks were still visible. Her hull number, 557, was clearly legible on both sides of her bow. The ship still looked like it was fighting, like it still hadn't given up. Even in death, 4 miles beneath the waves, the Johnston holds her position. Her guns are still aimed at an enemy that retreated nearly 80 years ago. Before he left, Vescovo brought his vessel to a stop on the surface above the wreck. The crew laid a wreath in the water and observed a moment of silence. The Johnston is a war grave, sacred ground, or sacred water, the final resting place of 186 American sailors who gave everything they had. There's a question that hangs over this entire story. Why did they do it? The Johnston didn't have to attack. Evans could have laid smoke, retreated with the carriers, and nobody would have blamed him. His job was to screen the carriers, not to fight battleships. He could have calculated the odds. 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 11 destroyers, against 1 destroyer with 5-inch guns. The Yamato alone outweighed his entire task force. One of her turrets weighed more than his ship. Any rational calculation said to run. Any sensible commander would have laid smoke, protected the carriers from a distance, and waited for help. But Evans didn't see it that way. His gunnery officer Hagen remembered what he said as they went into that first attack. A good navy is not a refuge for the incompetent. Evans understood something that military theorists sometimes forget. Sometimes the math doesn't matter. Sometimes the odds don't matter. Sometimes you're in a position where retreat means someone else dies, and the only thing you can do is attack. He couldn't save his ship, but maybe he could save the carriers. Maybe he could save the soldiers on the beach. Maybe by fighting hard enough, by being aggressive enough, by refusing to quit, he could change the equation. And he did. The Johnston and ships like her convinced a Japanese admiral with overwhelming force that he was facing something far more dangerous than 6 escort carriers and 7 small ships. They convinced him to retreat at the moment of victory. 130,000 American soldiers lived because Ernest Evans chose to charge. In 2023, the U.S. Navy announced that a new Arleigh Burke-class destroyer would be named USS Ernest E. Evans. It will be DDG-141, and it will carry the name of that Cherokee fighter from Oklahoma into the 21st century. The Johnston herself was struck from the Navy Register on November 27, 1944, barely a month after she went down. Officially, she no longer exists. But her story refuses to sink. Every year, until they couldn't anymore, the survivors held a reunion. They remembered their shipmates. They told the story of those 2 hours off Samar. The last surviving officer, Robert Hagen, the gunnery officer who put over 200 shells into the Kumano, who wiped red dye off his face and joked, "Looks like somebody's mad at us," who watched his captain fight until there was nothing left to fight with, passed away in 2009. But we still have his words, written just months after the battle, published in the Saturday Evening Post. At 10:10, the USS Johnston rolled over and began to sink. A Japanese destroyer came up to 1,000 yards and pumped a final shot into her to make sure she went down. A survivor saw the Japanese captain salute her as she went down. That was the end of the Johnston. No, that wasn't the end, because that Japanese captain understood something. Standing on his bridge, watching a tiny destroyer sink after fighting his entire fleet, he recognized what he was seeing. He had witnessed men who refused to quit, men who charged into certain death rather than let their comrades be destroyed, men who turned impossible odds into victory through nothing but courage and will. That salute wasn't mockery, it was recognition. One warrior acknowledging another. The Johnston lies 4 miles down in the dark of the Philippine Sea, her guns still pointed at an enemy that retreated 8 decades ago. She's still fighting, and she always will be. If you made it this far, you now know one of the greatest naval stories ever told. A story of a Cherokee commander who told his crew, "I intend to go in harm's way," and then proved it in the most spectacular way possible. The Johnston charged battleships with destroyers. She took on 23 enemy ships with 3. She fought until she literally couldn't float anymore. And she won. Not by surviving, but by winning. In the end, Commander Evans and 185 of his men paid the ultimate price. But 130,000 American soldiers went home to their families. 6 escort carriers survived. The Philippine invasion succeeded. The math said it was impossible. Ernest Evans didn't care about the math. "This is going to be a fighting ship," he told his crew on day 1. They believed him. They followed him, and when the moment came, they fought with him until there was nothing left. If you want more stories like this, stories of ordinary people who did extraordinary things when everything was on the line, make sure you're subscribed, because there are more stories out there. More heroes who never got the recognition they deserved. More battles that changed history. Men like Simo Haha, the Finnish sniper who killed over 500 Soviet soldiers with iron sights. Men like Desmond Doss, the medic who saved 75 men on Okinawa without ever carrying a weapon. Men like Mad Jack Churchill, who fought World War II with a longbow and a sword. Every one of their stories started the same way Ernest Evans's did, with someone who decided that the odds didn't matter, that retreat wasn't an option, that sometimes the only thing you can do is attack. Remember what Ernest Evans told his crew, "I intend to go in harm's way." Sometimes that's all you need to know.